In the autumn of 1940, four teenagers were walking through the woods near the village of Montignac in the Dordogne region of southwestern France when their dog disappeared into a hole in the ground. The dog's name was Robot. The hole, which the boys had noticed before but never explored, led into a cave. When the boys followed Robot into the darkness and lit their oil lamp, they found themselves in a chamber whose walls were covered in paintings. Animals moved across the stone in ochre and manganese and charcoal: horses, aurochs, deer, bison, bears. The figures were executed with a vitality and a skill that the boys, standing in the first electric silence of a discovery, immediately recognized as extraordinary. They returned the next day, and the day after. On the fifth day, they told their schoolteacher. Within weeks, the painter Pablo Picasso had visited the cave, and according to witnesses, emerged saying that we have invented nothing. Lascaux had been sealed by a rock fall approximately 15,000 years ago. The paintings inside it, which date to between 15,000 and 17,000 years ago, had been executed by artists who were fully modern human beings in every cognitive and cultural sense, people who had language and social organization and a cosmological imagination that could produce art of a complexity and a power that moves viewers emotionally today. Before Lascaux, the dominant view of Paleolithic humans was that they were primitively simple, barely distinguishable from the animals they hunted. After Lascaux, that view was no longer possible. Subscribe now and stay for the next documentary. Every week we go somewhere that most people have never been, in the hours designed for rest and for the kind of thinking that only happens in the dark. The history of archaeology is full of accidental discoveries. The discipline began, in a sense, with accidental discoveries, with farmers and builders and children stumbling across objects that turned out to be important, and with those objects making their way eventually to scholars who could interpret them. The systematic, planned excavation of known sites with scientific methodology is a 20th century development. For most of the history of contact between the modern world and the ancient one, the mechanism of discovery has been chance encountering curiosity. But the accidental discoveries that have most profoundly changed our understanding of human history are not randomly distributed. They cluster around specific types of circumstances. The digging of wells and irrigation channels, which penetrates the soil at depths that expose ancient deposits, the construction of buildings, roads, and other infrastructure, which disturbs ground that has been undisturbed for centuries or millennia, the movements of animals, which dig and burrow and erode in ways that expose what the soil conceals, and the actions of children, who explore spaces and pursue objects with a freedom from preconception that sometimes leads them to things that adults, with their expectations of what is worth looking at, would have passed by. The paintings of Lascaux were so extraordinarily preserved because the sealed cave had maintained a constant temperature and humidity for 15,000 years, creating conditions that prevented the biological processes of decay. The sealing of the cave by the rockfall had been both the cause of its inaccessibility and the condition of its extraordinary preservation. When it was opened to the public in 1948, it quickly became one of the most visited prehistoric sites in France, attracting nearly 100,000 visitors per year by the early 1960s. But that visitation introduced human breath, body heat, and the microorganisms that human beings carry with them into an environment that had been isolated from biological influence for 15 millennia. The carbon dioxide from visitors' breath, combined with the warmth of their bodies and the light of the electric lighting installed for tourists, began to trigger the growth of algae and fungi on the cave walls, threatening the very paintings that the visitors had come to see. The cave was closed to the public in 1963, only 4 years after Picasso's visit, and has remained closed ever since. A precise replica, Lascaux II, was opened nearby in 1983, allowing visitors to experience the cave's content without threatening its preservation. The original cave is now monitored by a team of conservators who have spent decades trying to understand and control the biological processes that the brief period of tourism set in motion. The discovery of the Dead Sea Scrolls is the most consequential accidental archaeological find of the 20th century, and its beginning is as simple as a young man throwing a stone. In the spring of 1947, a Bedouin shepherd named Muhammad Dib was searching for a stray goat in the rocky desert near the northwest shore of the Dead Sea, in what was then British Mandatory Palestine. He threw a stone into a cave opening on the cliff face above him, and instead of the thud he expected, he heard the sound of pottery breaking. When he and a companion entered the cave, they found a series of tall ceramic jars, some intact and some broken, containing wrapped leather scrolls. The scrolls were written in a script that neither of them could read, and their significance was not immediately apparent. The young shepherd took some of the scrolls and eventually sold them to an antiquities dealer in Bethlehem. The serendipity of archaeological discovery has a philosophical dimension that archaeologists rarely articulate, but that shapes the entire discipline. Every significant discovery changes not just what is known but what questions can be asked, and the questions that can be asked determine the future course of research. Before Lascaux, the question of Paleolithic artistic sophistication was not being asked, because the answer seemed obvious. Paleolithic humans were primitive, and primitive humans did not produce sophisticated art. After Lascaux, that question had to be taken seriously, and its taking seriously led to the discovery of dozens of other decorated caves, to the development of new dating methods for ancient pigments, and to a fundamental revision of the cognitive model of Paleolithic humans. The discovery did not just add a fact, it opened a research program. The scrolls made their way through a series of transactions to scholars who could identify their significance. Roland de Vaux, a French Dominican priest and archaeologist based in Jerusalem, recognized that the scrolls might be ancient when he examined photographs of them in 1948, and he organized an excavation of the cave where they had been found. That excavation and the subsequent systematic survey of the surrounding cliff faces revealed 11 caves containing manuscripts, the largest collection of ancient Jewish texts ever found. The Dead Sea Scrolls include manuscripts of every book of the Hebrew Bible except the Book of Esther, in versions that are in some cases 1,000 years older than the previously known manuscripts of those texts. They include sectarian texts of the community that produced them, almost certainly the Essenes, a Jewish sect that had established a community at the nearby site of Qumran. And they include previously unknown texts that document the extraordinary diversity of Jewish religious thought in the period immediately preceding and following the birth of Jesus of Nazareth, a diversity that the later development of both Judaism and Christianity had obscured. The scholarly significance of the Dead Sea Scrolls cannot be overstated. They transformed the understanding of the development of the Hebrew Bible, revealing that the text of individual books was more variable in the Second Temple period than had been thought. They documented forms of Jewish religious belief and practice that the emergence of Rabbinic Judaism after the destruction of the Second Temple in 70 CE had left out of the surviving literature. And they provided contemporary evidence for the religious environment in which the earliest Christian communities developed, changing the understanding of the relationship between early Christianity and Second Temple Judaism. All of that from a stone thrown by a bored shepherd looking for a goat. The science of ancient DNA extracted from archaeological specimens has transformed the study of accidental discoveries by making it possible to extract information from organic materials that appears to be inert. A bone fragment, a tooth, a piece of preserved skin or hair that an earlier generation of archaeologists would have described primarily by its morphology can now be subjected to genomic sequencing that reveals the genetic ancestry of the individual it came from, the disease organisms present in their body at the time of death, the plants and animals they had eaten, and in some cases the sounds they could hear or the colors they could see. The application of ancient DNA analysis to the accidentally discovered ice maiden of Mount Ampato revealed not just her genetic ancestry, but the specific pathogens present in her body and the particular strain of tuberculosis that may have contributed to her physical condition before her sacrifice. That level of biological detail about a specific individual who lived 500 years ago, extracted from a body that was found by accident on a melting glacier, represents a kind of historical intimacy that no other methodology can achieve. The discovery of the Terracotta Army of the first emperor of China is one of the most dramatic accidental finds in the history of archaeology, and it came within the lifetime of the people who made it. In March 1974, a team of farmers in Shaanxi province were digging a well on the outskirts of the ancient capital of Xi'an when their shovels hit something unexpected. Fragments of terracotta, pieces of modeled clay that proved to be parts of human-scale figures. The farmers reported the find to the local cultural authorities, and the excavation that followed over the subsequent months and years revealed one of the most extraordinary archaeological complexes in the world. 3 separate pits containing more than 8,000 life-size terracotta warriors, more than 130 chariots, and approximately 600 terracotta horses, arranged in military formation and accompanied by weapons of actual bronze. The army had been created by the workshops of Qin Shi Huang, the first emperor of a unified China, who ruled from 221 to 210 BCE. The figures had been manufactured in standardized components, with mass-produced bodies and limbs combined with individually modeled heads, giving each figure a distinctive facial appearance that has led some researchers to suggest that the heads were based on real individuals. The weapons carried by the figures were actual functional weapons, not replicas, and the bronze arrowheads and swords recovered from the pits are of a precision and a metallurgical quality that was not matched in Europe until the Industrial Revolution. The Terracotta Army guarded the approaches to the burial mound of Qin Shi Huang himself, which is located nearby and which has not been excavated. Chinese historical texts describe a burial chamber of extraordinary richness, containing a model of the empire complete with rivers of flowing mercury representing the actual rivers of China, a pearl-studded ceiling simulating the night sky, and traps designed to kill any tomb robber who attempted to enter. Modern geophysical surveys of the mound have detected elevated concentrations of mercury in the soil above the burial chamber, consistent with the ancient descriptions, and a large underground structure that matches the scale described in the texts. The discovery of the Chauvet Cave by Chauvet, Brunel, and Hilaire had an immediate and dramatic effect on the understanding of the Upper Paleolithic, but it also produced one of the most extensive and sophisticated programs of non-invasive documentation that any archaeological site has ever received. Because the French Ministry of Culture decided to close the cave to all but essential scientific visits from the moment of its discovery, in order to avoid repeating the fate of Lascaux, the cave has been studied primarily through documentation rather than through excavation. Thousands of photographs, detailed topographic surveys, three-dimensional laser scans, and extensive sampling for dating purposes have produced a database of extraordinary richness that has been shared with researchers around the world. That approach, which prioritized documentation over access, has produced knowledge that would have been unavailable from direct physical investigation of the cave, because the undisturbed floor sediments have preserved evidence of bear activity, human footprints, and the remains of prehistoric fires that would have been destroyed by unrestricted visitor access. The decision not to excavate the burial mound of the first emperor reflects both the precautionary approach of Chinese archaeologists, who recognize that current excavation technology would damage materials that future technology might recover undamaged, and the cultural and political sensitivity of the site as the tomb of the founding figure of Chinese imperial civilization. That decision, which has been maintained for 50 years, is one of the most consequential acts of archaeological restraint in the modern era. The burial mound of Qin Shi Huang contains, almost certainly, some of the most remarkable ancient objects ever created. Whether and when they will be excavated is one of the great open questions of 21st century archaeology. The discovery of Tutankhamun's tomb in 1922 is the most famous archaeological find of the 20th century, And while it was not entirely accidental, it came at a moment when the archaeologist responsible for it had been within centimeters of abandoning the search. The discovery of the Vinland map in the 1950s illustrates the darker side of the history of accidental discovery. The possibility that an apparently significant find is not what it appears to be. The Vinland map, which purports to be a 15th-century cartographic representation of a world that includes a landmass labeled Vinlanda Insula to the west of Greenland and Scandinavia, was presented to Yale University in 1965 as evidence of pre-Columbian Norse knowledge of the North American continent. If genuine, it would have been the earliest known cartographic representation of the Americas. Chemical analysis of the ink, however, revealed the presence of anatase, a form of titanium dioxide that was not produced commercially until the 1920s, suggesting that the map is a modern forgery. That conclusion has been contested by some researchers, and the debate about the map's authenticity has persisted for decades. The Vinland map illustrates that the desire for discoveries that rewrite history creates a market not just for genuine ancient objects but for forgeries designed to satisfy that desire, and that distinguishing the two requires the kind of careful scientific analysis that was not available to scholars who first encountered the map. Howard Carter had been searching for the tomb of the young pharaoh Tutankhamun in the Valley of the Kings since 1917, funded by the British nobleman Lord Carnarvon, who had grown increasingly impatient with the lack of results. By 1922, Carnarvon had informed Carter that this would be the final season of work. If nothing significant was found, the project would be abandoned. On November 4, 1922, a young water carrier working at the site stumbled over what proved to be a step cut into the bedrock. It was the first step of a staircase leading down to the sealed entrance of a tomb that had lain undisturbed for more than 3,000 years. When Carter made a small hole in the sealed inner door of the tomb on November 26, 1922, and held a candle up to it to see in the darkness, the scene that met his eyes was one that he would describe for the rest of his life. In the flickering light of the candle, he could see objects everywhere: golden animals and statues and chariots and couches, glittering in the first light that had entered the chamber since it was sealed around 1323 BCE. When Lord Carnarvon, standing behind him, asked if he could see anything, Carter's reply became one of the most famous sentences in the history of archaeology. Yes, wonderful things. The tomb of Tutankhamun was the tomb of a minor pharaoh who died young, one of the least significant rulers in the long history of ancient Egypt. And yet its contents, which took 10 years to fully document and remove, included objects of such extraordinary craftsmanship and such remarkable preservation that they have become the defining images of ancient Egyptian civilization in the modern imagination. If the tomb of a minor pharaoh could contain such treasures, what might the tombs of the great pharaohs contain? Most of those tombs were plundered in antiquity, and the answer to that question will probably never be fully answered. But the partial answer provided by Tutankhamun's tomb changed the understanding of the material culture of ancient Egypt in ways that continue to shape Egyptological research today. The near miss of the Tutankhamun discovery, the fact that Carter had been within days of abandoning the search when the water carrier stumbled over the step, is a reminder of how contingent the history of discovery is. The step that was found could have been disturbed or covered by later debris if the excavation had proceeded differently. The funding could have run out before it was found. The water carrier could have walked half a meter to one side. The history of archaeological discovery is full of such contingencies, and the near misses are invisible by definition. We cannot know what has been almost found. The discovery of the Antikythera mechanism, the most sophisticated mechanical device known from the ancient world, came from the bottom of the Aegean Sea through the work of Greek sponge divers, who were not looking for ancient machines but for sponges. In October 1900, a crew of Greek sponge divers from the island of Symi were sheltering from a storm near the small island of Antikythera, between the Greek mainland and Crete. When the storm passed, the captain, Demetrius Kondos, sent a diver down to survey the seafloor for sponges. The diver, Elias Stadiatus, surfaced in a state of apparent incoherence, reporting visions of naked women and horses on the seafloor below. Suspecting decompression sickness, Condas himself dived, and what he found was a wreck, the remains of a Roman-era ship that had gone down approximately 2,000 years earlier, carrying a cargo of Greek sculpture and bronze objects. The discovery of the Bronze Age village of Flag Fawn in eastern England was triggered by a drainage engineer who noticed ancient timbers in the mud during routine maintenance of a drainage channel in 1982. The investigation that followed revealed one of the most significant prehistoric sites in Britain, a platform of 400,000 timbers constructed over a period of approximately 400 years between roughly 1300 and 900 BCE, surrounded by standing water in the fens and used as a place for the ritual deposition of metalwork and other objects. The preservation of the organic materials at Flag Fawn was extraordinary. The waterlogged conditions that made the site difficult to excavate had also preserved wood, textiles, insects, and plant remains that would have decayed completely in a drier environment. The discovery of Flag Fawn transformed the understanding of Bronze Age religious practices in Britain and provided a wealth of information about the material culture and environment of the period that no dryland site could have matched. The discovery of the Folsom Points in New Mexico in 1927 and the subsequent identification of the Clovis Points in 1932 transformed the understanding of when and how the Americas were first inhabited by human beings. The Folsom Points, stone spearheads found in direct association with the bones of an extinct species of bison at a site near Folsom, New Mexico, demonstrated that human beings had been present in North America at least 12,000 years ago, at a time when large Pleistocene animals that are now extinct were still alive. That discovery overturned the prevailing view that human occupation of the Americas was at most a few thousand years old and established a new framework for the prehistory of the Western Hemisphere. The Clovis culture, named for the site in New Mexico where its distinctive fluted points were first identified, was subsequently found at sites across North and South America and was for decades assumed to represent the first Americans, the founding population from which all subsequent indigenous Americans descended. But the evidence has continued to mount that the Americas were inhabited before the Clovis culture, and the current understanding is that the first Americans arrived at least 16,000 years ago and possibly considerably earlier, by routes that are still being debated. The subsequent recovery operation, conducted in collaboration with the Greek government and the Greek Navy, retrieved dozens of bronze and marble sculptures, glass objects, jewelry, and coins. And it retrieved a corroded lump of bronze that nobody at the time recognized as anything in particular. The lump sat in the National Archaeological Museum in Athens for 2 years before anyone examined it closely enough to notice that it contained geared wheels. The Antikythera mechanism, as it came to be called, is a hand-powered computing device that modeled the movements of the sun, the moon, and at least 5 of the planets known to the ancient Greeks. It tracked the phases of the moon, predicted solar and lunar eclipses using the Saros cycle, displayed the positions of the zodiacal constellations, and may have tracked the 4-year cycle of the Olympic Games. The mechanism consists of at least 30 gears, some with as few as 15 teeth and some with as many as 223, arranged in a differential gearing system of extraordinary complexity. Nothing comparable to it is known from any other ancient culture, and no mechanism of similar complexity appeared in Europe until the mechanical clocks of the 14th century CE, more than 1,000 years later. The discovery of the Antikythera mechanism required the revision not just of the history of technology but of the history of science. It demonstrated that the ancient Greeks had achieved a level of mathematical and mechanical sophistication that had not been credited to them, and it raised questions about what else might have existed in the ancient world that has not survived. The mechanism is a unique survivor. The conditions of preservation on the seafloor allowed it to survive when objects of similar complexity in terrestrial contexts would have been melted down or destroyed. How many other devices of comparable sophistication existed in the ancient world and were lost is a question that can never be answered. The discovery of the Altamira cave paintings in Spain predates Lascaux by 60 years, and its story illustrates the human tendency to reject what does not fit existing frameworks of understanding. In 1868, a Spanish nobleman named Marcelino Sanz de Sacciuola was shown an entrance to a cave near his estate in Cantabria by a local hunter. He visited the cave several times over the following years without exploring it systematically. In 1879, he brought his 8-year-old daughter Maria with him to the cave while he searched for artifacts on the floor. Maria, being small enough to hold a lamp while looking up at the ceiling without difficulty, was the first person in modern times to see the ceiling paintings of Altamira, a frieze of bison and horses and deer executed in polychrome, using the natural contours of the ceiling to give the animals a three-dimensional presence. Sanz de Sacciuola was an amateur naturalist who recognized immediately that the paintings were ancient and significant. He published a monograph describing the paintings in 1880, attributing them to the Paleolithic period. The response from the professional archaeological and prehistoric community was almost uniformly dismissive. The paintings were too sophisticated, too accomplished, to have been produced by Paleolithic humans, who were assumed to have been cognitively primitive. The professional consensus declared the paintings to be forgeries, and Sanz de Sacciuola spent the rest of his life, he died in 1888, defending their authenticity against the skepticism of the experts. The discovery of the Ötzi the Iceman, preserved in the glacier on the border between Austria and Italy since approximately 3300 BCE, is one of the most remarkable accidental finds of the 20th century, and it came within hours of being lost again. In September 1991, two German hikers, Helmut and Erika Simon, were descending from the Finilspitz peak in the Ötztal Alps when they noticed a human body face down in a gully in the glacier ice. They assumed it was the body of a recently deceased mountaineer and reported it to the authorities. The recovery of the body, which was only partially exposed from the ice, was conducted in a hurried and not entirely careful manner, with workers using ice picks and ski poles to free the body from the surrounding ice. It was only when the body reached the University of Innsbruck and was examined by forensic scientists that its extraordinary antiquity was recognized. Ötzi was not a modern mountaineer, but a man who had died on the mountain more than 5,000 years ago, preserved in the glacier for more than 5 millennia. The circumstances of his death were reconstructed over subsequent years of analysis. He had been struck by an arrow in the left shoulder, which severed a major blood vessel and caused his death, and the arrow was shot from behind, suggesting that he was murdered. He is, remarkably, the oldest known murder victim in European history. He was vindicated posthumously. When other Paleolithic cave paintings began to be discovered in France in the 1890s and 1900s, in caves whose remoteness made forgery implausible, the scientific community gradually revised its view of Paleolithic cognitive capacity and acknowledged that the Altamira paintings were genuine. The vindication came too late for Sanz de Sacciuola, who had been subjected to sustained professional humiliation for proposing something that was true. The discovery of the Homo naledi fossils in the Rising Star Cave system in South Africa in 2013 was the result of deliberate caving by researchers looking for fossils, but the finds themselves were entirely unexpected and revealed a species of hominin that had not previously been identified anywhere. The Rising Star system had been known to cavers for years, but the narrow chute that led to the Dinaledi chamber, the main fossil-bearing area, was too small for most adults to pass through. The paleoanthropologist Lee Berger specifically recruited a team of small-bodied scientists who could fit through the chute, and when they entered the chamber, they found the bones of Homo naledi in extraordinary abundance. More than 1,500 fragments representing at least 15 individuals. The species, with its combination of primitive and derived features, proved extremely difficult to place in the existing framework of human evolution, and subsequent dating revealed that it had survived until relatively recently, approximately 236 to 335,000 years ago, at a time when anatomically modern humans were already present in Africa. The implication that multiple species of hominin coexisted in Africa for a substantial period of time has transformed the understanding of human evolutionary history. The Altamira story is a cautionary tale about the relationship between accidental discovery and scientific consensus. The discovery itself was real. The paintings were there, on the ceiling of the cave, visible to anyone who looked. What was not immediately real was the conceptual framework that could accommodate what had been found. The paintings required a revision of the understanding of Paleolithic humans so significant that the professional community preferred to accuse the discoverer of fraud rather than accept the revision. That pattern, in which accidental discoveries challenge existing frameworks and are initially rejected, is a recurring theme in the history of science. The discovery of the Rosetta Stone in 1799, during Napoleon's Egyptian campaign, transformed the understanding of ancient Egyptian civilization by providing the key to deciphering hieroglyphic writing. The stone was found by French soldiers under the command of Captain Pierre-François Bouchard, who were digging the foundations of an extension to the fortifications of Fort Julien near the town of Rashid, which the French called Rosetta, in the Nile Delta. One of the soldiers noticed that a large stone slab being used in the existing fortification wall bore inscriptions on its face, and Bouchard recognized that the inscriptions might be significant and brought the stone to the attention of the French scholars accompanying the expedition. The stone bore an inscription in 3 scripts: hieroglyphic, Demotic, and Ancient Greek. The Greek text could be read by the scholars and proved to be a decree issued by a council of Egyptian priests in 196 BCE honoring the pharaoh Ptolemy V. The recognition that the 3 texts were translations of the same decree provided the key that scholars needed to begin the process of deciphering the hieroglyphic and Demotic scripts by comparison with the known Greek. The decipherment of hieroglyphs was completed by Jean-François Champollion in 1822, more than 20 years after the discovery of the stone. That completion opened the vast literature of ancient Egypt to scholarly understanding for the first time. The texts inscribed on the walls of temples and tombs, on papyri buried with the dead, on administrative documents and religious texts that had been accumulating for 3,000 years, suddenly became readable. The history of ancient Egypt, which had been known primarily through the accounts of Greek and Roman writers and through the visual evidence of the monuments, was transformed by the emergence of the ancient Egyptians' own testimony about themselves. The role of children in accidental archaeological discoveries deserves more attention than it typically receives. Children are overrepresented in the history of significant discoveries relative to their numbers in the archaeological community, for reasons that are not entirely coincidental. Children explore environments with less purposefulness and more openness than adults, following paths and investigating spaces that adults would bypass as unpromising. They are physically smaller, able to fit into spaces that adults cannot access. And they have not yet developed the framework of expectations that tells adults what is worth looking at and what is not. The boy who followed Robot the dog into Lascaux was acting on canine curiosity rather than on any understanding of what might be significant in a hole in the ground. Maria Sans de Sassuola was holding her lamp up to look at the ceiling not because she had any reason to expect paintings there, but because looking at ceilings is something that children do. The combination of small size and uninhibited curiosity is, it turns out, surprisingly effective at revealing things that have been hidden for millennia. The Rosetta Stone did not itself contain significant new information about ancient Egypt. It was a bureaucratic decree of no great literary or historical interest. Its importance was entirely instrumental, as the key that unlocked everything else. That is one of the distinctive features of accidental discoveries. They are not always important in themselves, but in what they make possible. The discovery of the site of Göbekli Tepe, which we have explored in another documentary, was in some sense accidental, but it was also the result of a specifically prepared mind encountering an unexpected opportunity. The site had been noted by archaeologists from the University of Chicago in the 1960s, who recorded it as a possible location of interest but classified the stone fragments visible above the surface as medieval or Byzantine remains. It was not until 1994, when a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt visited the site and recognized the significance of what he was seeing, that systematic excavation began. The history of the discovery of the Maya civilization by Western scholars illustrates the difference between finding something and understanding it. The ruins of Maya cities had been known to European explorers and colonists since the 16th century, and the Spanish administrative records of the colonial period contain descriptions of large stone structures in the jungle. But the significance of those structures, their origin, and their relationship to the living Maya people was not understood by European observers for centuries. It was not until the publication of Incidents of Travel in Central America, Chiapas, and Yucatan by John Lloyd Stephens and Frederick Catherwood in 1841, with Catherwood's extraordinary lithographic illustrations of the ruins, that the European and American public became aware of the extent and sophistication of Maya civilization. Even then, many scholars were reluctant to attribute the ruins to the ancestors of the contemporary Maya people, preferring instead theories that attributed them to lost tribes of Israelites, Phoenicians, or other Old World civilizations. The possibility that the indigenous inhabitants of Central America had independently developed one of the most sophisticated civilizations in the history of the world was for many 19th-century observers too radical a revision of their existing understanding of human history to accept. Schmidt's recognition of the site required more than just looking at the stones. It required a theoretical framework for understanding what the stones might be, a framework that Schmidt had developed through years of thinking about the social and organizational preconditions for the Neolithic Revolution. He had concluded that monumental construction must have preceded the development of agriculture, rather than following it as the conventional model assumed, and that therefore sites of monumental construction from the Epi-Paleolithic period must exist somewhere in the Fertile Crescent. When he stood on the hill at Göbekli Tepe and saw the shaped stones, he knew immediately what he was looking at, even though what he was looking at was something that no existing model of Paleolithic social organization had predicted. That combination of accident and preparation is the most productive condition for discovery. The accident provides the encounter with the unexpected. The prepared mind provides the capacity to recognize the significance of what has been encountered and to develop the encounter into a discovery rather than an observation. The University of Chicago team that visited the site in the 1960s had the encounter but not the prepared mind. Their existing framework told them that shaped stone at a prehistoric site must be medieval, and they saw what their framework told them to see. Schmidt had both the encounter and the prepared mind, and the result was the discovery of the oldest known monumental architecture on Earth. The discovery of the ice mummies of the Andes, particularly the mummy known as the Ice Maiden or Juanita, represents a different kind of accidental discovery, one made possible by a natural event rather than a human action. The discovery of Pompeii and Herculaneum, the Roman cities buried by the eruption of Vesuvius in 79 CE, were not accidental in the strict sense, since the locations of both cities were known from ancient sources. But the first systematic excavations of the sites in the 18th century produced discoveries of such extraordinary richness and completeness that they function in the history of archaeology as the equivalent of accidental discoveries, encounters with the past of an immediacy and completeness that transformed the understanding of the ancient world. The streets of Pompeii, frozen at the moment of the eruption with bread still in the ovens, election graffiti still on the walls, and the casts of the victims still in the positions in which they died, provided a window into daily life in a Roman provincial city that no amount of literary study of ancient sources could replicate. The discovery of the Villa of the Papyri at Herculaneum, with its library of more than 1,800 carbonized papyrus scrolls, the source of the Herculaneum scrolls we discussed earlier, provided the ancient world's most complete surviving private library, which is still in the process of being read 2.5 centuries after its discovery. In September 1995, a volcanic eruption at Mount Ampato in the Peruvian Andes caused a deposit of ice and snow to melt and slide down the upper slopes of the mountain. The melt exposed the edge of an Inca burial that had been sealed in the ice for approximately 500 years. When the American anthropologist Johann Reinhard and his Peruvian colleague Miguel Zarate reached the site, they found on the surface the feathered headdress and some textile objects that had been displaced by the melting ice. Following the trail of displaced objects, they found the mummy of a young woman, later estimated to have been between 12 and 15 years old at the time of her death, preserved in the ice with an extraordinary completeness that no intentional burial in a temperate environment could have achieved. The Ice Maiden, who was sacrificed in an Inca ritual called Capacocha, in which selected children were offered to the gods at high-altitude mountaintop shrines, was preserved to a degree that made it possible to study her biology in ways that would have been impossible from a conventionally preserved mummy. DNA analysis revealed information about her genetic ancestry and her relationship to modern indigenous populations of the region. CT scanning revealed the cause of her death, a blow to the right side of the skull, delivered from above and behind, consistent with being struck by a ritual implement while kneeling. Isotopic analysis of her hair revealed details of her diet in the final months of her life, showing that she had been fed a significantly richer diet than was typical for girls of her social status in the period before the sacrifice. The accidental character of the Ice Maiden's discovery was entirely dependent on the volcanic eruption that melted the ice that preserved her. Without that eruption, she might have remained in the ice for another 500 years, or for 5,000. The climate change that is now causing glaciers and ice fields throughout the Andes to retreat at unprecedented rates is exposing archaeological materials that have been preserved for centuries or millennia, creating a race between the discovery and documentation of those materials and their deterioration once exposed to the air and the sun. The Ice Maiden was discovered at the right moment, when the ice had exposed her but before the elements had destroyed her. Hundreds of other ice mummies and ice-preserved organic materials around the world are being exposed by the same process, and most of them will not be found in time. The discovery of the Viking settlement at Lascaux Meadows in Newfoundland, Canada, confirmed one of the longest-standing debates in the history of European exploration: whether the Norse sagas describing a land called Vinland to the west of Greenland were historical accounts or literary inventions. The debate had persisted for decades when, in 1960, the Norwegian explorer Helge Ingstad and his wife, the archaeologist and Stein Ingstad, were conducting a survey of the Newfoundland coast looking for evidence of pre-Columbian Norse occupation. They were directed by a local fisherman named George Decker to a series of grass-covered ridges near the settlement of Lascaux Meadows that the local people called the Indian Camp. When the Ingstads examined the ridges, they recognized them as the outlines of Norse-style longhouses, the distinctive rectangular earth-covered structures used in Norse settlements in Greenland and Iceland. The discovery of the Olduvai Gorge fossil beds in Tanzania, one of the richest sources of early human fossils and stone tools in the world, came about through the work of a German entomologist named Wilhelm Catwinkel, who visited the gorge in 1911 while searching for butterflies. Catwinkel stumbled upon the gorge accidentally while following a butterfly and nearly fell into it. The fossil bones he noticed on the exposed walls of the gorge prompted him to bring samples back to Germany, where they attracted the attention of paleontologists. Subsequent expeditions, culminating in the decades of work by Lewis and Mary Leakey from the 1930s onward, made Olduvai Gorge one of the most important sites in the study of human evolution. The Leakey's discovery of Homo habilis, Australopithecus boisei, and numerous other hominin fossils at Olduvai, along with thousands of stone tools documenting the development of early lithic technology, fundamentally changed the understanding of when and where the human lineage diversified. A German entomologist following a butterfly into a gorge contributed, by his stumbling, to the foundation of the science of paleoanthropology. The excavations that followed, conducted by and Stein Ingstad from 1961 to 1968, revealed the remains of 8 buildings, including dwellings, a smithy, and a carpentry workshop, dating to approximately 1000 CE, 5 centuries before Columbus's arrival in the Americas. The discovery was not entirely accidental in the sense that the Ingstads were specifically searching for Norse remains, but the specific location was provided by the local knowledge of George Decker, who would not have known the significance of the grass-covered ridges, but who had noticed that they were different from the natural terrain and had preserved that observation in his local lore. The Edna Revolution, the ability to detect the presence of organisms from the environmental DNA they leave behind in soil, water, and sediment without requiring the discovery of actual physical remains, is transforming the detection of past human activity at sites that might otherwise never be discovered. At an ancient lake in Denmark, the analysis of Edna from sediment cores revealed the presence of Neolithic farmers at the site 3,000 years earlier than any other evidence indicated, demonstrating that early agricultural communities had reached the area far sooner than the conventional archaeological chronology suggested. At a site in the Yukon in Canada, Edna from permafrost deposits revealed the presence of a suite of Pleistocene megafauna including woolly mammoths, horses, and cave lions at a location where no physical remains of those animals had ever been found. Those discoveries were not accidental in the traditional sense. They were the result of deliberate scientific investigations. But they share with accidental discoveries the character of revealing what was invisible, of bringing into knowledge things that had existed but had not been seen. Lascaux meadows proved that Norse explorers had indeed reached the North American continent around 1000 CE, establishing the earliest known European presence in the Americas. The settlement appears to have been used as a base for further exploration rather than as a permanent colony, and the archaeological evidence suggests that it was occupied for only a few decades before being abandoned. The reasons for the abandonment are not known, but the sagas suggest that conflicts with the indigenous peoples of the region were a significant factor. The discovery of Lascaux meadows also illustrates the importance of local knowledge in archaeological discovery. George Decker had no idea that the grass-covered ridges near his home were the remains of a 1,000-year-old Norse settlement. But he had observed that they were there, remembered that observation, and was willing to share it with people who could understand its significance. That kind of local observation is the foundation of many of the most important accidental discoveries in archaeology. The observational knowledge of farmers, fishermen, shepherds, and children who live close to the land and who notice things that outsiders might pass by without seeing. The discovery of the Nika caves in the Mexican state of Chihuahua, with their extraordinary selenite crystals, was an industrial accident that produced one of the most visually stunning geological finds of the 21st century. In 2000, workers drilling a new tunnel in the Nika silver and zinc mine broke through into an underground chamber approximately 300 meters below the surface. The chamber, which came to be known as the Cave of Crystals or the Giant Crystal Cave, contained selenite crystals of extraordinary size. The largest was 11 meters long, 1 meter in diameter, and weighed approximately 55 tons. The crystals had grown in the underground chamber over the course of approximately 500,000 years, nourished by the hydrothermal fluids circulating through the rock. The chamber was not an archaeological site in the conventional sense, but the crystals it contained were a record of geological time of a kind that has no parallel anywhere else on Earth. And the microbiological research that followed the discovery revealed something extraordinary. The crystals contained ancient microorganisms that had been dormant within the crystals for between 10,000 and 50,000 years, sealed inside fluid inclusions in the selenite. Those microorganisms, when carefully extracted and cultured in the laboratory, were revived. They were alive after being sealed in crystal for tens of thousands of years. The discovery had implications for astrobiology. If microorganisms can survive for 50,000 years in fluid inclusions within crystals, then the possibility of microbial survival over geological timescales in similar conditions on other planetary bodies, such as the ice of Mars or the ocean floor of Europa, becomes more plausible. The Nika cave was discovered by accident, by workers doing their jobs in an industrial mine, and it turned out to contain evidence relevant to one of the most fundamental questions in the search for life beyond Earth. The discovery of the Sutton Hoo ship burial in England in 1939, on the eve of the Second World War, is one of the most significant accidental discoveries of the 20th century, though like many such discoveries it was also the result of deliberate investigation triggered by a chance observation. Edith Pretty, the owner of the land at Sutton Hoo in Suffolk, had noticed that several large mounds on her property seemed to be ancient burial mounds and asked a local archaeologist, Basil Brown, to investigate them. Brown's excavations in 1938 found some grave goods but nothing spectacular. In 1939, he began excavating the largest of the mounds and discovered the corroded iron rivets of a large wooden ship that had been used as a burial chamber. The wood of the ship had rotted away over 14 centuries, leaving only a ghost in the soil, a dark shadow of decayed wood that preserved perfectly the shape of an Anglo-Saxon warship approximately 27 meters long. Inside the ghostly hull, the burial goods of a king were found, including a magnificent helmet, gold and garnet jewelry of extraordinary craftsmanship, a ceremonial shield, a sword with a jeweled pommel, silver vessels from the Byzantine world, and dozens of other objects that collectively represent the most complete early medieval royal burial ever found in Britain. The discovery that what appeared to be natural hills in various parts of the world were actually ancient burial mounds or artificial structures has been repeated so many times in the history of archaeology that it has become a methodological principle. If a feature of the landscape seems unusually regular or unusually prominent relative to its surroundings, it is worth investigating whether it is a natural feature or a human construction. The burial mounds of Sutton Hoo, the coffin of Japan, the tumuli of the Greek and Etruscan worlds, the platform mounds of the Mississippian culture in North America, and the mounds of the Hopewell and Adena cultures of the American Midwest all presented themselves to initial observers as natural landscape features. The recognition of those features as human constructions and the subsequent excavation of their contents has in each case produced a fundamental revision of the understanding of the societies that built them. The discovery of the Staffordshire hoard in 2009 is the largest find of Anglo-Saxon gold and silver metalwork ever made, and it came from a field in the English Midlands that had been ploughed and farmed for centuries without yielding anything of significance. Terry Herbert was a metal-detecting enthusiast who had been searching farmland in Staffordshire with the permission of the landowner for about 5 years before he found anything notable. In July 2009, his metal detector produced a signal over an unremarkable patch of soil. He began to dig, and what came up were gold fittings of extraordinary quality and craftsmanship. Over the following days, he recovered more and more objects, until he had filled bag after bag and finally called the authorities. The subsequent professional excavation of the site by archaeologists from Birmingham Museum and the local authority recovered more than 5,000 objects in total, including helmet fittings, sword pommels, crosses, and other ecclesiastical and military objects, all made with the finest Anglo-Saxon goldsmithing techniques and many decorated with intricate cloisonné enamel and garnets. The hoard dated to the 7th century CE, the period of the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, and is believed to represent the military treasure of a powerful nobleman or king, stripped from the defeated enemies of a successful warrior. The Staffordshire hoard changed the understanding of Anglo-Saxon artistic achievement. The objects it contained were of a quality that had not previously been recognized as characteristic of the period, and their discovery demonstrated that the so-called Dark Ages, the centuries between the end of Roman Britain and the Norman conquest, were in fact a period of extraordinary artistic sophistication and material culture. The finding also renewed interest in the history of the Mercian kingdom, which controlled the region where the hoard was buried, and prompted a re-examination of the political history of 7th century England. The role of amateur metal detecting in the discovery of the Staffordshire hoard is both a strength and a potential vulnerability of the British system of managing archaeological finds. The Portable Antiquities Scheme, which encourages detectorists to report their finds to professional archaeologists, means that objects like those in the hoard are recorded and preserved rather than sold privately. But the same technology that allowed Terry Herbert to find the hoard also allows less scrupulous detectorists to find and remove objects from protected sites without reporting them, and the black market for undocumented ancient objects continues to destroy the archaeological context of what is found. The discovery of the Chauvet Cave in France in 1994 pushed the history of human artistic expression back by another 15,000 years beyond Lascaux, and it did so through a discovery that combined the deliberate search of experienced cavers with the alertness of a prepared mind. The accidental discovery of the Rosetta Stone had a counterpart in the decipherment of the Mayan script, which was achieved not through a single dramatic find but through the long and difficult work of generations of scholars, and which was nearly derailed by the actions of a 16th-century Spanish bishop. Diego de Landa, who served as Bishop of Yucatan in the 1560s, conducted a comprehensive burning of Maya books and manuscripts in 1562, destroying an unknown quantity of Maya written records in an effort to eradicate indigenous religious practices. The magnitude of that loss cannot be precisely quantified, but it is certain that documents containing information about Maya history, astronomy, religion, and literature were destroyed that would have made the subsequent decipherment of the Maya script far easier and far faster. The irony is that de Landa also wrote an account of the Maya script and its pronunciation, the Relation de las Cosas de Yucatan, which proved to be one of the essential keys to the eventual decipherment in the 20th century. The man who destroyed the primary sources also left one of the tools needed to recover access to them. Jean-Marie Chauvet, Eliette Brunel, and Christian Hilaire were experienced cavers who had been exploring the cave systems of the Ardèche Gorge in southern France for years. On December 18, 1994, while exploring a known cave entrance, they detected a draft of air from a blocked passage. They cleared the blockage and found a narrow shaft that led downward into a previously unknown cave system. When they entered the decorated chambers of the cave, they found paintings of extraordinary quality and diversity. Horses, rhinoceroses, lions, mammoths, bears, cave hyenas, and many other animals, executed with a mastery of line and shading and perspective that modern artists have studied and admired. The Chauvet paintings were initially dated by radiocarbon analysis to approximately 30 to 32,000 years ago, making them more than 15,000 years older than the paintings at Lascaux. That dating was controversial. The sophistication and quality of the paintings seemed inconsistent with such an early date. Many researchers assumed that such accomplished art could only have been produced by a more recent culture. But subsequent dating has confirmed the original estimates, and the Chauvet paintings are now accepted as genuine Upper Paleolithic art dating to approximately 30 to 35,000 years ago. The discovery of the Sanxingdui civilization in Sichuan province, China, is one of the most dramatic archaeological revelations of the 20th century, and it came through a series of accidental and semi-accidental encounters between farmers and the extraordinary bronze and jade artifacts of a previously unknown Bronze Age culture. The first significant finds were made by a farmer who was digging a drainage ditch on his land in 1929 and encountered a large cache of jade objects. Those finds were partially recovered and partially dispersed before archaeologists could conduct a systematic investigation. A second major discovery was made in 1986, when workers at a brick factory discovered two large sacrificial pits containing thousands of bronze objects, jade artifacts, elephant tusks, and other materials dating to approximately 1200 to 1000 BCE. The objects recovered from those pits represented an artistic and cultural tradition that had no parallels in the contemporary Chinese Bronze Age cultures of the Yellow River Valley. The bronze masks with their enormous protruding eyes, the towering bronze tree with its fruit and birds, and the other objects from the pits were so unlike anything previously known from Bronze Age China that they required the complete revision of the understanding of Bronze Age Chinese civilization. The implications of Chauvet for the understanding of human cognitive evolution are profound. At 32,000 years ago, modern humans had only recently arrived in Europe, having dispersed from Africa within the previous 10,000 years. The production of art of the quality and complexity visible at Chauvet by those early modern humans demonstrates that the full range of human cognitive capabilities, including the capacity for complex symbolic representation, aesthetic judgment, and the planning and execution of large-scale artistic projects, was already present in our species at its earliest known appearance in Europe. The cognitive revolution, whatever it was, had already occurred. The pattern that emerges from the history of accidental archaeological discoveries is one of deep time breaking through into the surface of the ordinary world. The farmer digging a well, the shepherd throwing a stone, the child following a dog, the soldier digging a foundation. All of them are going about the business of the present when the past erupts into their experience with a force that permanently changes both. The past is not safely contained in museums and textbooks and the pages of scholarly journals. It is under the ground beneath every city, every field, every beach and riverbank. It is in the ice of every glacier and the sediment of every lake. It is in the walls of every old building and the soil of every garden. The ordinary world rests on a foundation of accumulated human activity that is almost entirely invisible to the people living on its surface. The acceleration of accidental discovery that has accompanied the development of industrial society is one of the paradoxes of the relationship between modernity and the ancient past. The construction of railways, motorways, pipelines, and foundations for large buildings penetrates the soil at depths that expose ancient deposits with a regularity that professional archaeologists cannot keep pace with. In Britain, the construction of the route for the high-speed 2 railway line has encountered more than 1 million artifacts and the remains of hundreds of ancient features, including Roman roads, medieval settlements, and Bronze Age burials. The construction of the Crossrail Tunnel in London encountered Roman riverside warehouses, medieval plague burials, and thousands of objects from every period of the city's history. The ordinary infrastructure of modern life is constantly and accidentally excavating the ancient past. The discovery that many important archaeological sites in the Amazon basin are not natural features of the landscape but human constructions has been one of the most transformative realizations in South American archaeology of the last 2 decades. The geoglyphs of the Brazilian state of Acre, geometric earthworks of extraordinary precision that were revealed by the deforestation of previously forested areas in the 1980s and 1990s, demonstrated that the western Amazon had been inhabited by complex societies with the organizational capacity to construct large-scale landscape modifications. The subsequent LiDAR surveys of the region, which could detect the earthworks beneath the remaining forest, revealed hundreds of previously unknown geoglyphs covering an area of approximately 13,000 square kilometers. Those geoglyphs, which include circles, squares, and other geometric shapes up to 300 meters in diameter, were constructed by a pre-Columbian Amazonian civilization that left no pottery or other material culture that could be identified from surface survey alone. Those construction-related discoveries are governed by legal frameworks that require developers to notify archaeological authorities and to conduct rescue excavations before development proceeds. Those frameworks have produced an enormous body of new archaeological knowledge, but they have also created a category of archaeological investigation that is driven by the pace of development rather than by the logic of research, in which sites are excavated not because they are the most important or the most interesting, but because they happen to be in the path of a road or a tunnel or a building foundation. The most unsettling implication of the history of accidental discovery is the implication about what has not yet been found. If a shepherd stumbling into a cave in the Dordogne could reveal 15,000-year-old paintings that transformed the understanding of human cognitive evolution, what else is preserved in the caves and sediments and ice of the world that has not yet been encountered? If workers drilling a mining tunnel in Mexico could break into a chamber containing half-million-year-old crystals that harbored dormant ancient microorganisms, what else is preserved in the geological record that no one has yet had the accident of finding? If a Turkish shepherd throwing a stone could lead to the discovery of a temple complex that predates all known civilization by 6,000 years, What other monuments from the deep human past are waiting beneath the surface of the world's most ancient landscapes? The answer, based on the rate of discovery in recent decades, is a great deal. The LiDAR survey of the Guatemalan lowlands revealed thousands of previously unknown Maya structures beneath the jungle canopy in a single survey campaign. The systematic survey of the Arabian Peninsula using satellite imagery has identified hundreds of ancient sites that were completely unknown to archaeology. The survey of the ocean floor using modern sonar technology is revealing sunken landscapes, drowned coastlines, and submerged archaeological features on a scale that was not previously imaginable. The discovery of evidence for ancient human occupation of North America prior to the Clovis culture has been one of the most contentious and consequential debates in American archaeology, and much of the key evidence has come from sites discovered accidentally or in the course of research directed at entirely different questions. The site of Monte Verde in southern Chile, which provided compelling evidence for human occupation of South America approximately 14,600 years ago, before the Clovis culture, was first identified by a geology student who noticed animal bones and pieces of wood in an eroded stream bank in 1975. The site of Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania, which provided evidence of human occupation dating to at least 16,000 years ago, was identified by James Adavaggio in 1973 when he was conducting a survey of prehistoric sites in the region. And the site of Chique White Cave in Mexico, which yielded stone tools possibly as old as 30,000 years, was found during a systematic survey but produced its most significant findings when a team was excavating what they thought was a relatively recent site and kept finding older and older materials the deeper they dug. The geography of undiscovered archaeological sites is not random. The regions with the most to reveal are those that have been least systematically surveyed. The interior of the Arabian Peninsula, large parts of Central Africa, the deep interiors of the Amazon and Congo basins, the high-altitude plateaus of Central Asia, and the shallow continental shelves around the world that were dry land during the last ice age and that are now submerged beneath up to 120 meters of water. Those submerged coastal landscapes were the most productive environments for hunter-gatherer societies, and they were inhabited by human populations for tens of thousands of years before the rising seas of the post-glacial period drowned them. The archaeology of those submerged landscapes, which has barely begun, may eventually produce a more complete picture of the prehistoric human world than anything that survives on the now dry land. Tonight, as you prepare to sleep, there are things beneath the ground and beneath the water and in the ice of the world's glaciers that have been waiting to be found since before the first cities were built. Some of them will be found by archaeologists conducting systematic research. Many will be found by accident, by children and farmers and workers and shepherds and dogs and the slowly retreating ice of a warming planet. And each one will add a new dimension to the story of what human beings have been, and for how long and in what ways. The past does not stay in the past. It surfaces. It surfaces through the accidents of discovery, through the erosion of time, through the penetration of the soil that every generation of farmers and builders and seekers carries out. And each surfacing reveals something that was hidden, something that changes the story, something that makes the world a stranger and richer place than it appeared to be before the discovery. Sleep now, knowing that the world under your feet is full of stories not yet told. They are patient. They have been waiting for a very long time, and they can wait a little longer. The emotional impact of significant accidental discoveries on the people who make them is a dimension of the history of discovery that rarely appears in the academic literature, but that shapes how those discoveries are communicated to the public. Howard Carter's description of seeing wonderful things when he looked through the hole in the wall of Tutankhamun's tomb has become one of the most quoted sentences in the history of archaeology, not because it conveys precise scientific information, but because it conveys exactly the emotional quality of the experience. The shock of beauty, the sudden confrontation with the deep past, the vertigo of looking into a space that has been dark for 3,000 years. That emotional quality, which is genuine and which the discovery genuinely produced, is part of what makes the story of archaeological discovery compelling to people who are not archaeologists and who will never excavate anything. The discoveries matter to people because the people who make them feel something, and communicating what they feel is as important as communicating what they find. The discovery of the Franche Thigh Cave in the Argolid region of Greece, during a survey of prehistoric sites in the 1960s, produced evidence that transformed the understanding of human occupation of the Aegean in the Mesolithic period. The cave had been used continuously by human populations from approximately 40,000 years ago to approximately 3000 BCE, providing one of the longest continuous records of human occupation at a single site anywhere in the world. The excavations of the cave, conducted by a team from Indiana University from 1967 to 1976, revealed a sequence of occupation that included the earliest evidence of long-distance maritime travel in the Aegean, in the form of obsidian from the island of Melos that appeared in levels dating to approximately 11,000 years ago. The discovery demonstrated that Mesolithic humans in the Aegean were capable of making open-water sea voyages of at least 150 kilometers, a technological and navigational achievement that was not expected from populations at that level of social organization. The discovery of the Vindolanda tablets in northern England, beginning in 1973, is one of the most vivid illustrations of how the ordinary materials of daily life can survive to provide an extraordinarily intimate glimpse of the past. The tablets, thin wooden writing tablets used by the Roman garrison at Vindolanda Fort near Hadrian's Wall in the late 1st and early 2nd centuries CE, were preserved in the waterlogged anaerobic conditions of the fort's rubbish dump. They contain personal correspondence between soldiers and their families, military duty rosters, requests for supplies, and invitations to birthday parties, all written in ink on wood that survived because the conditions of preservation prevented the bacteria that would normally have decomposed them. The most famous of the tablets is an invitation written by Claudia Severa to her friend Sulpicia Lepidina for her birthday party, which is the earliest known example of handwriting by a woman in the Latin world. Those tablets, found in the mud of a rubbish dump by archaeologists excavating a fort that was otherwise unremarkable, have done more to make the human reality of Roman Britain vivid than all the inscriptions, sculptures, and coins combined. The pattern of discovery at Pompeii, where each new excavation reveals not just objects but entire domestic spaces frozen at a specific moment in time, represents the gold standard of accidental archaeological preservation, the sudden sealing of an inhabited environment by a natural catastrophe. The eruption of Vesuvius in August of 79 CE killed the inhabitants of Pompeii and Herculaneum not immediately but over the course of a night and a day, during which most residents fled. Those who stayed, either because they could not flee or because they chose not to, were killed by the pyroclastic surges that followed the initial fall of pumice, and their bodies were preserved in the volcanic deposit. When excavators in the 19th century discovered hollow spaces in the volcanic rock where bodies had decomposed, they developed the technique of pouring plaster into the cavities to create casts of the bodies at the moment of death. Those plaster casts, which show the victims in the positions they died, with the expressions of their final moments preserved, are among the most moving objects in the history of archaeology. The actual physical form of people who lived 2,000 years ago, preserved by the accident of a volcanic eruption. The discovery of the ice cores of Greenland and Antarctica, while not accidental in the strict sense, produced findings so unexpected that they function in the history of climate science as the equivalent of accidental discoveries. When the first deep ice cores were drilled in Greenland in the 1960s and analyzed for their oxygen isotope composition, the expectation was that they would reveal a smooth, gradual transition from the cold climate of the last glaciation to the warm climate of the current interglacial. What they revealed instead was a record of dramatic, rapid climate changes. Temperature shifts of 10 degrees Celsius or more occurring over periods as short as a decade or two. Those rapid climate transitions, which have been confirmed by subsequent cores from both Greenland and Antarctica, transformed the understanding of the stability of the Earth's climate system and established that the climate can change not gradually, on geological timescales, but rapidly, on timescales comparable to a human lifetime. That finding, which was entirely unexpected when the first cores were analyzed, has had profound implications for the understanding of climate change past and present. The discovery of the Terracotta Army also transformed the understanding of the scale and organization of imperial Chinese workshops in the Qin period. The 8,000 figures, the chariots, and the horses were not created by a single workshop or by a handful of master craftspeople. They were the product of a highly organized industrial production system that distributed different aspects of the manufacturing process to different workshops and then assembled the finished components into complete figures. The standardization of the components, which allowed heads, bodies, arms, and legs to be produced separately and combined in different configurations, implies a level of logistical organization and quality control that has more in common with a modern industrial production system than with the craft workshops that most people associate with ancient manufacturing. The discovery of the army did not just reveal the aesthetic achievements of the Qin period. It revealed the organizational and industrial capabilities of a society that was, by any measure, one of the most sophisticated in the world at the time of its existence. The discovery of parchment pages from the Codex Sinaiticus, one of the oldest and most complete manuscripts of the Christian Bible, by the German biblical scholar Constantin von Tischendorf at the monastery of St. Catherine at the foot of Mount Sinai in 1844, is one of the most important and most ethically complex accidental discoveries in the history of biblical scholarship. Tischendorf, visiting the monastery in the course of a research journey through the eastern Mediterranean, noticed a basket of parchment pages that monks were apparently using as fuel for the fire. Recognizing the pages as ancient and significant, he rescued some of them and eventually, on subsequent visits, persuaded the monastery to give or lend him the rest of the manuscript. The manuscript, which dates to the 4th century CE, contains the entire New Testament in Greek along with much of the Old Testament, and its text differs in significant ways from the texts that had been the standard basis of biblical scholarship. The discovery transformed New Testament textual criticism and produced a century of debate about the relationship between the Codex Sinaiticus text and other early Christian manuscripts. The rediscovery of the Minoan civilization at Knossos in Crete by the British archaeologist Arthur Evans beginning in 1900 was not accidental in the strict sense, but depended on a series of accidental prior encounters between local farmers and the decorated pottery and seal stones that lay just below the surface of the site. Evans had been collecting Minoan seal stones from the Athenian antiquities market for years before he visited Crete, and when he arrived at Knossos, he had a specific theoretical framework for understanding what he might find. But the scale and sophistication of what the excavations revealed, the palatial complex with its elaborately decorated rooms, its frescoes depicting the bull-leaping ritual and other scenes of Minoan life, its sophisticated drainage and storage systems, and its vast archive of clay tablets inscribed in the still undeciphered Linear A and Linear B scripts, exceeded anything that even Evans had anticipated. The discovery of Knossos revealed a Bronze Age civilization in Europe of a sophistication that transformed the understanding of the prehistory of the Mediterranean world. The discovery of the ancient city of Ubar in the Arabian Peninsula, which had been described in medieval Arabic geographical sources as a legendary lost city destroyed by God, was achieved in 1992 through the application of space-based remote sensing technology to ancient landscape features that had been invisible from the ground. Archaeologists and explorers from the United States and Great Britain analyzed satellite imagery and shuttle imaging radar data from NASA to identify ancient caravan routes in the Rub al Khali Desert of Oman, and those routes all converged on a single point at the edge of a limestone formation. Excavation at that point revealed the remains of a substantial ancient city that had collapsed into a sinkhole formed by the dissolution of underlying limestone caverns, the probable origin of the legend of divine destruction. The discovery of Ubar demonstrated that the combination of historical sources, remote sensing technology, and archaeological fieldwork could locate sites that were genuinely lost. Cities known from ancient accounts but whose locations had been unknown for centuries. The discovery of ancient astronomical instruments in unexpected contexts has been one of the recurring surprises of 20th century archaeology. The Antikythera mechanism, discovered in a shipwreck, was not the only sophisticated astronomical device to emerge from unexpected circumstances. Ancient astronomers' notebooks and tables found in Babylonian archives, discovered during excavations in Mesopotamia in the 19th and early 20th centuries, revealed a sophistication of mathematical astronomy that transformed the understanding of ancient science. And the discovery that several megalithic monuments of the British Isles were deliberately oriented toward astronomical events, a realization that developed slowly through the analysis of survey data collected for other purposes, demonstrated that the construction of sophisticated astronomical observatories was a capability of Neolithic societies that was not previously recognized. Each of those discoveries required not just the physical finding of the material, but the intellectual recognition of what the material represented, and in each case that recognition came years or decades after the physical discovery. The scientific study of the Lascaux paintings has itself been a source of discoveries about the cognitive capabilities of Paleolithic humans that go beyond what any individual finds could have suggested. The analysis of the paintings using multispectral imaging, three-dimensional laser scanning, and the precise mapping of the spatial relationships between figures has revealed that the artists used the natural contours and projections of the cave walls to give their animals a three-dimensional quality that makes them appear to move when viewed in the flickering light of an oil lamp. The cave was not simply decorated. It was designed as a visual experience in which the specific quality of Paleolithic lamplight was an essential element of the intended effect. The artists understood how the light would interact with the forms they had painted and exploited that interaction deliberately. That level of sophisticated planning, involving the anticipation of a specific viewing experience in a specific lighting condition, implies a cognitive complexity that goes beyond the simple execution of representational art. The discovery of the Cosquer Cave near Marseille in France, in 1985, is unique in the history of cave art discoveries because the entrance to the cave is now 37 meters below the surface of the Mediterranean Sea, submerged by the sea level rise that followed the end of the last ice age. The cave was discovered by a diver named Henri Cosquer, who had been exploring the underwater coast and found an underwater passage leading to an air pocket above the water. When he explored the air pocket, he found himself in a cave whose walls were decorated with paintings and engravings. The cave contains the oldest known marine animal art in prehistoric Europe, including images of seals, great auks, and fish, as well as horses, bison, and other land animals. The cave was inhabited when the sea level was lower, during the period from approximately 27,000 to 19,000 years ago, and the submerged entrance is the consequence of the post-glacial rise of the Mediterranean. It is a reminder that the drowned continental shelves of the world's oceans contain not just the settlements and camps of Paleolithic coastal populations, but also, potentially, decorated caves and other cultural features that are among the most important evidence of early human cultural life. The discovery of the sunken city of Thonis Heracleion in the waters of Abu Qir Bay in Egypt, beginning in 2000, is one of the most remarkable underwater archaeological finds of the 21st century. The city, which was the main entry port for ships entering Egypt from the Mediterranean in the first millennium BCE, had been lost for more than 1,000 years, its existence known only from ancient Greek texts and inscriptions that referred to it as one of the great trading cities of the ancient world. The discovery was made by the French underwater archaeologist Frank Gaudio and his team, who were conducting a systematic survey of the bay using sub-bottom profiling and magnetometry. The survey revealed the outlines of the ancient city preserved under several meters of sediment on the seafloor, including statues, temples, coins, jewelry, and the remains of more than 60 ships, making it the largest collection of ancient wrecks ever found in a single location. The city had been destroyed, apparently by a combination of earthquakes, subsidence, and tsunamis, sometime around the 8th century CE, and had sunk gradually into the soft sediment of the bay, where it was preserved in extraordinary condition. The role of professional intuition in recognizing the significance of accidental discoveries is one of the least understood but most important aspects of the history of archaeology. The ability to recognize that a fragment of pottery is unusual, that a soil discoloration represents a buried feature, or that a corroded lump of metal might contain hidden mechanical complexity is not a skill that can be fully articulated in methodological terms. It is the product of years of experience with the material culture of a specific period and place, and it is the trained perception that allows an archaeologist to see what an untrained observer would miss. Howard Carter's recognition that the step cut in the bedrock was worth investigating, rather than being a natural feature or the remains of an insignificant ancient structure, reflected 30 years of experience in the Valley of the Kings. Klaus Schmidt's recognition of the shaped stones at Göbekli Tepe reflected 20 years of thinking about the social organization of the late Epi-Paleolithic. Those recognitions were not accidents. They were the product of professional preparation that made the observer ready to encounter the unexpected. The discovery of the Tong child in South Africa in 1924, the first fossil of Australopithecus africanus ever found, came about through the work of a limestone quarry and the curiosity of a young anatomy professor. Workers at the Tong limestone quarry in what is now the northwest province of South Africa encountered a skull embedded in the rock and brought it to the attention of Raymond Dart, a professor of anatomy at the University of the Witwatersrand in Johannesburg. Dart recognized immediately that the skull was that of an ape-like creature, but one with distinctly human-like features, including a brain case proportionally larger than any known ape and teeth that were more human than ape in their proportions. He published a paper in Nature in 1925 announcing the discovery of a new genus and species, which he named Australopithecus africanus, and proposed that it represented an evolutionary link between apes and humans. The response from the established paleoanthropological community in Europe was skeptical. The dominant view was that human evolution had occurred in Asia, not Africa, and the Tong skull did not fit that framework. It was not until the discovery of further Australopithecus fossils in the Transvaal in the 1930s and 1940s that the African origin of the human lineage began to be accepted. The discovery of the Tong child from a limestone quarry was not just a fossil find. It was the beginning of the shift of paleoanthropological attention from Asia to Africa that has now produced the current consensus that our lineage originated on the African continent. The long history of accidental discovery in archaeology has produced a methodology for managing those discoveries that is itself a significant cultural achievement. The development of planning policy statements for archaeology in Britain, which require developers to assess the archaeological potential of sites before construction and to conduct archaeological excavations where significant remains are expected, represents the institutionalization of the lesson that the construction of modern infrastructure constantly and accidentally encounters the ancient past. Similar frameworks exist in most developed countries, though their effectiveness varies considerably with the resources devoted to their enforcement. Those frameworks represent a recognition that the past is not a thing of the past but a constant presence in the present, available to anyone who digs deep enough, and that managing that presence requires deliberate institutional attention rather than leaving it entirely to accident. The discovery of ancient astronomical knowledge encoded in the landscape features of indigenous cultures around the world has been one of the recurring surprises of modern archaeoastronomy. The medicine wheels of the North American plains, circular arrangements of stones that at certain locations are aligned with the rising or setting positions of specific stars or with the sunrise at the summer solstice, were recognized by mainstream scholarship as astronomical devices only in the 1970s, after being dismissed for decades as the products of random or ceremonial activity with no systematic design. The discovery of the precise astronomical alignments in those structures, which had been maintained by indigenous peoples as elements of their spiritual and ceremonial practice, required the kind of careful measurement and mathematical analysis that academic archaeology had not thought to apply to features that it had not recognized as sophisticated human constructions. The medicine wheels are a reminder that the difference between a structure that is recognized as astronomically significant and one that is not always a difference in the structure itself, but in the framework of the observer. The discovery of the ship burial at Sutton, who came within months of being impossible. The excavation that revealed it was conducted in the summer of 1939, and in September of that year the Second World War began, interrupting archaeological work across Britain for 6 years. Had the excavation been delayed by a single season, the burial might have remained undiscovered for the duration of the war, and the disturbance of the wartime use of the Sutton Hoo estate as a military training area might have destroyed it before it was found. The timing of the discovery, within weeks of the beginning of the war, is one of the narrower near misses in the history of British archaeology. The subsequent careful recording of the finds by the excavation team, conducted under the shadow of the approaching conflict, preserved information that would otherwise have been lost when the archaeologists dispersed to their wartime duties. The history of accidental discovery is, ultimately, a history of the relationship between human curiosity and the incompleteness of human knowledge. Every accidental discovery reveals something that was previously unknown, and every revelation of the unknown reveals in turn how much remains unknown. The shepherd who found the Dead Sea Scrolls could not have known that his stone would unlock the most important manuscript discovery of the 20th century. The teenager who followed his dog into Lascaux could not have known that the paintings on the cave walls would transform the understanding of human prehistory. The farmer who stumbled over the terracotta sherds in Shaanxi could not have known that he had found the most spectacular monument ever created to a single ruler's desire for immortality. Those people were doing ordinary things in ordinary places, and the extraordinary erupted into their lives without warning. That is how most of the most important things have been found, not by systematic searching, but by the ordinary world opening unexpectedly into the extraordinary. And it will continue to happen, in fields and caves and quarries and lake beds, for as long as the past continues to exist beneath the surface of the present. The discovery of ancient musical instruments in archaeological contexts has provided a different kind of window into the past than the visual arts that dominate most discussions of prehistoric culture. The bone flutes of the Swabian Jura in Germany, carved from vulture wing bones and mammoth ivory approximately 40,000 to 43,000 years ago, are the oldest musical instruments ever found, and they were discovered during systematic excavations of cave sites in the region, not by accident. But the significance of what was found could not have been fully appreciated before the development of experimental archaeology, which demonstrated that the instruments could produce a range of notes and that they were deliberately tuned rather than being the accidental result of drilling holes in bones for other purposes. The discovery that modern humans were making music 40,000 years ago is not just an archaeological fact. It is evidence of a social and cognitive life of extraordinary richness, in which the organization of sound into patterns intended to be heard and appreciated by others was already an established part of human experience. The discovery of the Shanidar Cave in Iraqi Kurdistan in 1951 by the American archaeologist Ralph Seletsky produced one of the most emotionally resonant finds in the history of paleoanthropology. The skeleton of a Neanderthal individual who had survived with severe physical disabilities that could only have been possible with the sustained care and support of other members of the group. Shanidar I, as the individual was designated, had suffered a crushing blow to the left side of his skull that had probably left him blind in the left eye, and his right arm had been so severely damaged, either before birth or by a later injury, that it had withered from the elbow down and the lower arm and hand had been amputated. Despite those disabilities, he had survived to an age of between 30 and 45 years. The survival of such a severely disabled individual into middle age, in the conditions of the Middle Paleolithic, could only have been possible if other members of the group had provided food, protection, and care over a period of years. The discovery of Shanidar I was the first substantial evidence that Neanderthals were capable of the kind of sustained social care for disabled and dependent members of the group that had previously been considered a uniquely modern human characteristic. If this documentary kept you company tonight, subscribe to the channel. There are more worlds waiting to be found, more accidental encounters with the deep past, more moments when the ordinary opens into the extraordinary. A new one every week, always in the dark, always continuing.